Andre Breton, a profound thinker, leader, and poet, founded the Surrealist movement with the publication of his 1994 essay, The Surrealist Manifesto. Beginning with a small group of French weirdos, Surrealism would go on to influence artists and creators around the world. While less popular these days, the effects of Andre Breton's Surrealist movement can still be felt today, from the bizarre, self-referential humor of TikTok to the strange blending of dream and reality in the Barbie movie. In this video, we'll be discussing a bit of Andre Breton's life before the Surrealist movement, some of the key takeaways from his Surrealist Manifesto, and discuss how ideas from this text are still useful to us today as writers and people. Born in 1896, Andre Breton lived a sad, sheltered childhood from which he never quite recovered. In a suburb of Paris, he lived with his parents, quote, under the care of his blandly ineffectual father and loveless, socially ambitious mother. Anxious that the boy make something of himself for the family's sake, and ill-satisfied with the rude and Marguerite Breton forbade her son from playing with the neighborhood or exploring his budding interest in literature. In her eyes, a waste of time. At the behest of his parents, Breton would serve as a medic in World War I, which he described as a kind of lesser evil. In a letter, he would say World War I was a, quote, cesspool of blood, mud, and idiocy. While his true passion was poetry and literature, he took a keen interest in psychiatry, and the psychoanalytic ideas of Sigmund Freud would prove to be very influential on Breton's work. In a letter, he described the influence of his time in war and how working with the mentally ill would go on to influence him.
I was sent to a center for disabled men sent home due to mental illness, including a number of acutely insane men, as well as more doubtful cases brought up on charges on which a medical opinion was called for. The time I spent there and what I saw was of signal importance in my life and had a decisive influence in the development of my thought. That is where I could experiment on patients, seeing the nature of diagnosis and psychoanalysis, and in particular, the recording of dreams and free association. These materials were from the beginning at the heart of Surrealism.
In addition to psychology, the influence of magical and mystical thinking cannot be missed in the work of Andre Breton. According to Mark Polizotti, he fell into studying Hermeticism, an ancient magical practice, the reading symbolist poetry which had abstruse formulations and sensual decadence. He was also influenced by French literary heavyweights such as Stéphane Mallarmé and Arthur Rimbaud, who both have a sort of magical, luminous quality to their writing. As Polizotti noted, poetry was a crystallization of Breton's belief that words and language could change the world, that they could act as passageways to a richer, more fulfilling universe, and even as tools for creating such a universe out of one's own inner resources. During his time in the military, he would meet, quote, the core of the early Surrealist group, Louis Aragon, Philippe Soupault, and Paul Alouard, all fledgling poets like himself. After the war, he would fall into the avant-garde and Dadaist movements, new movements in the European art scene that focused on experimentation, boundary pushing, and cultural advancement. He would quickly go on to co-write a book with friend and fellow surrealist Philippe Soupault called The Magnetic Fields, which was an early venture into his practice of automatic writing. One writer would begin writing sentences that the other would go on to finish, using their new writing technique. It appears they wanted to mirror, quote, aspects of the hysterics and psychotic experience and their own process of artistic production. However, the book was not received well by either the French literary scene or Sigmund Freud, who Breton emphatically sent a copy of the manuscript to. In 1924, Breton published one of his most important works, the Manifesto of Surrealism. Highly influential, the work blended Breton's influences into a single school of thought. Not simply a way of writing, but a way of interacting with the world. Age 28, an age some might call the return of Saturn, Breton expressed his dissatisfaction with the way life had seemingly beat out of him notions of freedom and imagination. All around him he saw men and women defeated by life, seemingly trapped in the same thought patterns. Breton sought a way out of this, a way back to the kinds of thinking possible in early childhood.
All he can do is turn back towards his childhood, however his guides and mentors may have botched it. There, the absence of any known restrictions allows him the perspective of several lives lived at once. Now, he is only interested in the fleeting, the extreme facility of everything.
This is to say, he was seeking a way back to the magic of possibility. The choices and events of life have a way of piling upon us, seemingly forcing us in a direction. For Breton, freedom, specifically the freedom of thought, that is, imagination, was the way out.
The mere word freedom is the only one that still excited me. Among all the many misfortunes to which we are heir, it is only fair to admit that we are allowed the greatest degree of freedom of thought. It is up to us not to misuse it. To reduce the imagination to a state of slavery is to betray all sense of absolute justice within oneself. Imagination alone offers me some intimation of what can be.
Drawing on his experience working with mentally ill soldiers, Breton looked to the way mad folk interacted with the world. Not only do the insane have an extreme amount of imaginative freedom, they also seem totally indifferent to the way society views them. If you don't believe me, take some time hanging out at the 7-Eleven on the corner of Division and 3rd in Spokane. While in many ways crippled societally, Breton looked to these madmen as a way to combat the overbearing shadow of realism, which dominated the artistic landscape he was responding to. In particular, Breton, perhaps unwisely, goes on to throw shade at heavyweight realist writers like Thomas Aquinas, Anatole France, and the great Fyodor Dostoevsky, whose writing he describes as schoolboy descriptions, and a simple game of chess which doesn't interest me. This rational, logic-driven philosophy, prevalent both in his time and ours, appears to work well for societal progress, but it also destroys a certain sense of magic, individuality, and possibility.
Under the pretense of civilization and progress, we have managed to banish from the mind everything that may rightly or wrongly be termed superstition or fancy. Forbidden is any kind of search for truth, which is not in conformance with accepted practices.
In accordance with Freud, who at the time was still a relatively obscure figure in the intellectual landscape, Breton looked to the dream world of sleep as an alternative to reality. His goal became to unite the limitless possibilities of the dream world, or what Freud called the unconscious, with the day-to-day lived experiences of the real world in order to create what he called a, quote, surreality.
I believe in the future resolution of these two states, dream and reality, which are seemingly so contradictory, into a kind of absolute reality, a surreality, if one may so speak. It is in quest of this surreality that I am going.
To access this surreality, this blended mode between the conscious and unconscious, Breton developed a technique called automatic writing, which is at the heart of his surrealist practice. This began, as often good writing does, with an idea that crossed Breton's mind at the verge of sleep.
A rather strange phrase came to me, which seemed insistent, and as though it was knocking at the window. This phrase astonished me. There is a man cut in two by the window.
Upon reflection, Breton, thinking of Freud, came to the conclusion that this was akin to the rapidity of something like spoken thought. But what exactly does that mean? Breton means that often we think much faster than we speak or write, then much of what we think isn't verbalized. For instance, if we can borrow more from Freud, I'm sure we've all had situations where we don't say precisely what we are thinking. Imagine your grandmother is asking how her famous meatloaf is tasting. It is ostensibly dry, bland, flavorless, something closer to dry cat food than a scrumptious, delectable meal. And while those thoughts might go through your head, you aren't going to say that. You're more likely going to say, "Of course, Grandma. It's great, just like always." This is what Freud might call a repressed thought, something that comes up from the unconscious and is sent back down, buried, like the meatloaf, under as much ketchup as you need to get it down. Repressed or unspoken thoughts aren't always necessarily bad or mean. Sometimes we just don't understand them, so we disregard them. This might be something like an intrusive thought. Maybe you think about throwing the meatloaf at the window. Or a bizarre dream. Maybe that night you go home and dream that the meatloaf is really a monster who wants to eat you from the inside out and take your place in the dry monotony of life. Like Freud, Breton thinks it is a mistake to throw away these bizarre thoughts that are often repressed, buried away, and that by ignoring them, we are ignoring important parts of ourselves. This is especially true for writers.
To you who write, these elements are, on the surface, as strange to you as they are to anyone else, and naturally you are wary of them. Poetically speaking, what strikes you about them above all is their extreme degree of immediate absurdity, the quality of this absurdity, upon closer scrutiny, being to give way to everything admissible, everything legitimate in the world, the disclosure of a certain number of properties and of facts no less objective in the final analysis than the others.
After this groundwork, Breton is finally ready to define his method of surrealism.
Surrealism, noun. Psychic automatism in its pure state, by which one proposes to express, verbally, by means of the written word, or in any other manner, the actual functioning of thought. Dictated by thought, in absence of any control exercised by reason, exempt from any aesthetic or moral concern. Encyclopedia, philosophy. Surrealism is based on the belief in the superior reality of certain forms of previously neglected associations, in the omnipotence of dream, in the disinterested play of thought. It tends to ruin once and for all other psychic mechanisms, and to substitute itself for them in solving all the principal problems of life.
From here, Breton goes on to explore in more depth his procedure for automatic writing, and how it might be applied in various ways in this subsection of his essay he calls Secrets of the Magical Surrealist Art. By starting in a passive state and reminding yourself that literature is, quote, one of the saddest roads that leads to everything, begin writing so fast that you can barely recall what it is you're writing about. Start making as many imaginative leaps as possible. And put your trust in the inexhaustible nature of the murmur. Automatic writing is as simple as that. While this text is at times perplexing, Breton was certain of its importance as a method, though perhaps not exactly as a systematized school of thought. He is quite certain that there will not be an establishment of conventional surrealist patterns anytime in the future, but maintains that the liberatory potential of surrealism for individuals to get in touch with their true, complete, wildly imaginative selves, to return to the vast imaginative potential of childhood when, as he says, we are most like our true selves. Breton was thus not interested with the future of surrealism. This isn't because he is dismissing the work he has done in establishing its foundation, but with the knowledge that he knows the work he has laid in the foundation will be built upon by others. Quote, "What work I have done, what I have left undone, I give it to you." So, what do we do with surrealism now that we know André Breton has given it to us? Well, whether or not we describe ourselves as surrealists, I do, but you don't have to. The techniques of surrealism have a wide variety of applications that I feel are increasingly helpful in modern society. As I noted before, it might help us understand the sense of humor prevalent on TikTok and YouTube, or the way movies like the Barbie movie work. But even more basic than that, the practice of automatic writing has, at least in my life, been incredibly practical. And as I reflect on my own journey as a writer, I realize more and more how similar the state achieved by automatic writing is to what others might call a flow state. If you're unfamiliar with the term, a flow state is, quote, a mental state in which a person is completely focused on a single task or activity. You've likely encountered this at some point with something you're very good at. Whether you're an athlete or a nurse, you've experienced this sense of true focus. This experience of the world around you dissolving, and the only thing that seems to exist is the thing you are focusing. Focus is something writers of all levels struggle with. In particular, gaining focus when we are starting to write. When we talk about writer's block or dealing with what some folks call the internal censor, that part of the brain that tells us whatever it is we're writing is bad, we're talking about that same logical realism that Breton was also fighting against. We are fighting against everyone who has told us our writing is bad. The internal censor is often comprised most damagingly of things we've heard other people say about us. It is a sort of feedback loop. And if the signal that has been sent into that feedback loop has been primarily negative, it's going to feel like an insurmountable enemy. Techniques like automatic writing force us to bypass that part of our brain, the part that wants to repress our thoughts, the part that tells us we are dumb, that we don't have anything worth saying. It allows us to engage with the wild wonders of the unconscious. It allows us to return to a time when our imagination was all we needed to tell a good story, to come up with a good idea, to feel like anything was possible. In general, I'm very aware of our cultural obsession with youth, our over-romanticization and obsession with looking and feeling young. But there's also something beautiful about returning to a state where we feel free from the constant negative feedback loops that we're bombarded with. A state where we know what we are capable of. A state of freedom. A state of pure psychic automatism.